Okay, good evening everybody, welcome to Salisbury Military History Society. A few housekeeping things. Our exits, keep them littered. And if you've got anything on you to go to keep, just turn it down for duration, please. It's good. Okay, so tonight we welcome renowned author Ian McGregor, who you may remember from Hiroshima Men Talk last year. And tonight he's going to talk about the lighthouse in Stalingrad, the hidden truth at the centre of World War II's greatest battle. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to me.
Thank you. Ian, you turn the lights going down? So I think the microphone's working. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Really appreciate it on such a really hot day. Makes my 5-hour drive from London very worthwhile. So I just thought I'd get that in, sorry. The lighthouse, which you'll see in a few photos' time, that is basically the code name for a very historic building if you're Russian. So without giving too many spoilers away, because you'll find out as I give you the talk, the lighthouse was this a building that had survived the first 6 weeks of the battle, and it was still standing. And this is a very rare photo that we've got here. That's the lighthouse you can see on the left-hand side. So it's right by the River Volga, and as you'll see when I show you an interactive map, it was perfect for reconnaissance and artillery spotting and that kind of thing. So both sides wanted it. But the story I'm going to tell, because this isn't really a talk about the Battle of Stalingrad. As we all know, it's enormous. Anthony Beevor's done the job that no one else needs to do. What I found interesting was I knew this story. I'd heard about this house called Pavlov's house, and it's a metaphor for the battle in terms of a few Russian Soviet Red Army soldiers snuck into this building, 4-story building, pretty much semi-destroyed, and they held off a whole German division in the battle for 58 days. And if you live in Russia, to them, it's their Alamo and Rorke's Drift all rolled into one. There's multi-million selling bestsellers been told about this fight. There's been films made, and Vladimir Putin even donated $10 million worth of rubles to make an interactive educational game for Russian children to then understand what happened. So we're going to really delve into that, and I think I hope you'll find it interesting. But so this is me. I was lucky to, because with all my books, I want to go to the place that I'm writing about, because I think you have to. You've got to walk the ground. And I was really lucky because, so this photo on the right with me, this is when we were in lockdown. I managed to get special permission as an academic to go to Russia. So he's not there anymore, but the guy who was director of the Volgograd Museum on the river, which you'll see, he was very much into having Western historians coming to the museum, says it's really important, we should be proud of what we've done, and we want you to look at our archives, because no one really comes to our archives. So he got me permission to fly. It was like 2 flights going from Heathrow, and I got on one of them. Then you go to Moscow, and then you get another flight, obviously down to the Caucasus. So this shot here, this is, because there are sections of the city that they still keep as it was. There's not many of them now because it's all been modernized, but this is in the factory district. So you can see, ironically, because of what happened yesterday, that chimney is right next to the weapons factory that pretty much makes most of their hypersonic missiles. But this was in 2022, so no one minded me standing in front of it. So yeah, that was, this is about November 15th, and it's about minus 22 in the shot. But anyway, let's get into the story. So, as you can see, and as I'm sure you all know, Mr. Putin loves to wrap up everything that he does, what his government represents, the fights he thinks he's doing for his people, in the traditions of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. So these were the celebrations for the 80th anniversary of the victory at Stalingrad in 2023. And as you can see, you've obviously got a very iconic T-34 tank rumbling through the main square in Volgograd. You've got children dressed up in the gear of the time, doing their marches. There were a few veterans that were still alive that they managed to get there and wheel out for the presentation. But obviously he's giving this speech, and he actually flew down. He doesn't go, as we all know, he doesn't really leave Moscow much anymore, but he actually went down to Volgograd to give the main speech in the main hall in 2023. And these are photos taken by a friend of mine who still lives there. He's from Volgograd, but he helped me when I was in the archives. And you've got to remember, this is 3 years ago. So on the left-hand side, they just started putting out propaganda posters about joining up for the new army, for the new fight in Ukraine. And as you can see, they really tie in the iconography of Stalingrad. So we'll see it in a little while, but you might know that famous statue on the left-hand side that's on the Motherland Calls, which is situated on the Mamayev Kurgan, the big hill in the center of Volgograd. And I haven't got photos of it here, but they actually raised a whole new brigade called the Stalingrad Brigade. And they had a big photo opportunity with them by the Mamayev Kurgan. And they have the statue as their main insignia on their sleeve. And even though I did ask my friends Yuri, Mikhail and Yuri, is there any news on the Stalingrad Brigade? He said, we don't hear anything about anybody. So they don't know what's happened to that brigade, but they went off to the front at least 2 years ago. But more importantly, my friend Mikhail took this shot because about a week before Putin's coming down to give his big speech, 2023, they start dressing up the main thoroughfares going into Volgograd with these enormous, as you can see, enormous posters and banners. That one's at least 4 stories high. And it's all the various heroes of the Soviet Union, you know, the ones that have won the medal, you know, the hero of the Soviet Union. This guy here is very important. That's Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. And he is the hero. And that's why the house, the defense of this house, this iconic house, is called Pavlov's house. And that's what I wanted to find out. At the time, I'll let you into a secret. My book was going to be a celebration of this house. I believed the story. I thought, this is true. What an epic 28 Red Army soldiers hold off a division that still at that time was about 5,500. You know, it was under strength, but it was still about 5,500 German troops with armor, artillery, air support. And they held this house in no man's land for 58 days. That's going to be a bestseller. But once I got to the museum, different story, and that's what we're going to talk about. So here is after the battle. So this is a state of Stalingrad where there's roughly around 80 to 90,000 civic and domestic buildings in the city. And by the end of the battle, 5.5 months of carnage, I think there's like 12% left. And so out of the roughly 800,000 civilians that were in the city, half of which were refugees that had fled into the city from the Germans' advance. Obviously, a lot of them were allowed to leave the city as the fighting really raged, but still, there was about 70,000 civilians at the start of the battle that stayed in the city, and roughly 6,000 survived. And so they start coming out with whatever they've got. But the BBC being the BBC, we had a man on the ground. So I'm hoping that this audio works. So this is the BBC correspondent, and he's giving a view of what he sees. And this was played in cinemas up and down the country in the UK.
The street was down there, if you can give the names right in places between roads, still there, all the marks of battle. There's the usual litter of helmets and weapons, tanks and ammunition, papers stuck in the snow, packet books from dead Germans, and any number of smashed boxes lying where they fell, or stacked up in great frozen heaps for later damage. Stalingrad can never be repaired. It will have to be rebuilt from the beginning. But even though all its buildings are wrecked, there's life in it still. Along the narrow stretch of cement-covered Kirkby River, which the Russians held through long months of assault, there's a city of dugouts. Dugouts occupied by the soldiers who have not yet left, and by a few women who stayed behind to launder and cook for the men. There's a real horrible atmosphere among these people today. They're the proudest men and women I've ever seen. They know they've done a terrific job, and they've done it well. Their city's been destroyed, and they've smashed the invader by sheer stubbornness and unconquerable courage. These men and women fought and worked for months with their backs to the river that that they had sworn never to repeat across, facing an enemy who held the only dominating part of Stalingrad and could pound them with shells and mortars unceasingly by day and night. They clung to their narrow foothold, and their feet never slipped.
So, different time, they were allies, and they won. So, in my research, I came along really interesting statistics. So, everyone wanted to be associated with Stalingrad after the battle because they're our allies. And that continued after the war. And if you look across Western Europe and going into Eastern Europe, once Stalin had obviously taken over a lot of the Eastern countries after 45, you'll find at least 3,000 parks, buildings, avenues, boulevards, stations named after Stalingrad. In Coventry, they've changed it now. Obviously, they changed it once the Ukraine war started. There was a Stalingrad Avenue. These are just two pictures because there's over 300 streets and boulevards in France alone that are named after Stalingrad that are still there. There's even a Stalingrad station on the Paris Metro. And that's the thing that goes back to what you've just heard of the BBC correspondent. That's why it was such a big international story, because it dominated the international news cycle for all those months the battle was going on, because it was seen as a crucial battle. So when I was there and I was walking the streets, and Volgograd wasn't Moscow, so it wasn't really in lockdown. There were still people going about their business, shops were open. And so you had access, you could freely walk around. And like I said, it was in wintertime. What struck me was just the scale of the monuments, because it's a metaphor for the scale of the destruction and the casualties. So you might recognize this one. This is outside the really famous grain silo in the south of the city. And that's where the Germans first encountered this really bitter, fanatical defense in urban combat. So it's literally a company of Red Army soldiers held off, I think, 2 German battalions in the first week of them trying to move into the south side of the city. And they pretty much fought to the last man, and they inflicted around about 400 or 500 casualties on just 2 German battalions. And that's probably one of the biggest monuments you can go to. It doesn't really do just that. That monument of that guy is around about 25 foot tall. I mean, it's enormous. And then this one I found actually more poignant. And this was just going down the side streets, very insignificant. As you can see, it's a boulevard of mainly flats in the suburbs. And what this represents is the Komsomols. This is young communists who are under about 15 to 17 years old maybe. And in those first bit of weeks of fighting, when the Soviets hadn't got all their forces into the city because they'd been expecting attack to the north that was going to come towards Moscow, they were caught on the wrong foot. So basically the defenders of Stalingrad in those first couple of weeks, when the Germans really should have taken the city, were factory militia, who were armed to the teeth, but they're still militia, a division of NKVD, about 10,000, pretty much all of which died to the last man. They did a lot of the fighting, and 20,000 young communists. So this statue, my translator said that, he read the caption. And again, these figures, this is the older brother saying goodbye to his sister and his younger brother. And all these statues always have a PPS submachine gun. That's the standard urban combat weapon that you'll see in statues, paintings and drawings around Volgograd. But that represents 20,000 died. So it's just taking in the scale of the destruction and death. And these statues are everywhere, and they're so prevalent. Maybe that's why to the locals, they don't really, they can just walk by because they see them every day. And then you can still find parts of the fighting if you go looking for it, and people live in these houses. So this is in the northern section, the factory district, and this is still standing. It's houses that belong to the factory workers. And there's not many of them. There's a couple of rows of houses. And again, I went into one of the stairwells, and as you can see, there's definite examples there of fighting. So there's shrapnel bursts, bullet holes, that kind of thing. And as I was taking these photographs, 2 women had their shopping. They were just going upstairs to their flat where they lived. And I think they purposely haven't been touched. They've been left that way on purpose. So you you can appreciate what went on. But there's not many because it's quite a gleaming new city. And as I was saying to Ian earlier, again, you find evidence of the fighting everywhere, even 80 years later. So here's that statue. This is on the Mame of Kurgan, and it was the big hill that splits the city in half. So topographically, militarily, you wanted that hill. And it's arguably one of the most contested sites of any theatre of the Second World War. Tens of thousands on both sides died, and the amount of munitions expended on it is just unreal. And my guide had said, you might find something. I said, well, I'm not so sure. And I tripped up on that. It's it's what's left of a heavy mortar shell, a Soviet one. And it was just the fin was sticking out the ground, so I'd stubbed my toe on it. And half an hour later, we dug it up. And I wasn't even looking for it. I just literally stumbled upon it. That's kind of emblematic of it's everywhere. You just can't escape it. So this is Pavlov's house. So this is what it looked like at the end of the battle. Seen better days. And this is what it looks today. So they've obviously completely rebuilt the whole of the city. This is right by the edge of the Volga. It's only about 100 meters away. Even though I've got this black and white photo, the building itself is a lovely kind of lemon color. And they've purposely left the one end, the gable end of the building there, because that still holds graffiti that the Soviet defenders put in there at the time. But the reason why this house survived is because it was for the party. So the center of the city and the northern center where the factory districts were, that's modern day Stalingrad by the time the Germans would have seen it once they advanced to the city. The southern end of Stalingrad was still quite, not medieval, but that's the original part of Stalingrad that had been there since it was a village 400 years before. So these kind of buildings had been built in the 30s, and they had the kind of things that if you're a loyalist in the party and you're high up, you've got hot and cold running water, gas, and electricity plumbed in, all that kind of stuff. But crucially, it's built with reinforced girders. So that's why it's still standing. So the majority of the buildings you guys would see if you went looking for imagery about the battle, those buildings are standing because they're reinforced. This would be right in the center of no man's land, like I said, and that's the interesting story that I wanted to find out about. Here, to show you just still how popular this is, every time I went to the building to take this shot, there were hundreds of people that are on holiday doing the tourist sites of the battlefields, taking photos of that. So I ended up going there on a Sunday morning at something like 7 o'clock in the morning, and a busload of about 200 Russian kids just turned up just after I got that photo taken. But it's a daily basis. It's like going to Trafalgar Square to see Nelson's Column. And this is the museum that you would come to. It's a very good museum. This is the Panorama Museum. And it's called the Panorama because on the left here you've got this dome, and it's enormous. It's absolutely huge. And they've done this 360-degree painting of every phase of the Battle of Stalingrad. And it takes your breath away. But more important for me was to the right that you can't see, they've got their archive. And what they decided to do, this museum was built under Khrushchev's time. And when Khrushchev took over, even though he was, as tough as Stalin, he wanted to have some kind of liberalization, and that spread to what they wanted to do in retaining memories of the Great Patriotic War. So because Stalingrad, he changed the name to Volgograd, but you've got the hero cities, 3 of which are Ukrainian, one of which is Sevastopol. But this museum was purposely set up to educate. So they put lots of adverts in the press across Russia to say to the millions of survivors, if you fought for whatever unit you served with at Stalingrad, please contact the museum. We'd like to have your memories. And so from the 63, 64 onwards, up until people weren't writing anymore, because obviously they're passing away, there are literally thousands and thousands of these little green school books. They're 48 pages, and that's what they write to the museum, say who they were, where they lived, and the museum would dispatch this little green book, and then they'd write down what they did, who they were, and what they suffered, what they witnessed, etc. And there are literally thousands of these school books in their archives. So that's what I basically did for about 8 days with a translator. I sat down because I knew exactly the kind of story I wanted to do. I wanted to find the unit that was around Pavlov's house, which was the 13th Guards Rifle Division. Famously, if you've seen Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law, the sniper, that's the 13th Guards Rifle Division. The film is obviously it's Hollywood, so nothing about it is accurate. But this is the file, and that's the ID of the commander of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, General Alexander Radimtsev. And so to get to the bottom, to celebrate this story, I thought, right, it was those guys that occupied Pavlov's house. I'm going to go and study theirs. So I read, over that course of 8 days, I read roughly about 500 files. Could have read a lot more, but I just didn't have enough time. But I wanted to get the key players. And that's where the story unveiled itself. But to get to how did we get there, I'm sure you all know, but this is primarily a presentation for schools and colleges, so I try and educate them. Barbarossa, 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler's great gamble to knock the Soviet Union out, kick the door in, it will fall like a rotten pile. It didn't, as we all know, even though the greatest invasion in modern history, 3 million men, nearly 4,000 tanks, 3 armored columns, primarily, though, a horse-drawn army, as many of you will know that. And the great gamble didn't work, even though they knock out nearly 6 million Red Army soldiers, 3 million killed, 3 million captured. Most of those 3 million captured didn't survive captivity. One of the statistics, again, I found out that staggered me was by the end of the war, the Red Army was about 14 to 16 million strong. But over the course of those 4 years of fighting, it had been rebuilt from scratch 4 times. Such were the losses, and such is the manpower Russia has. So the German army stopped by the Russian winter, as we all know. So by the spring, Hitler Directive 41, what's he going to do? He can't obviously attack again on the scale of Barbarossa. He hasn't got the men. They've lost over 1 million. Their armored strength completely destroyed. Again, another statistic of that, I think it was 3,700 tanks that they had originally for Barbarossa. By the end of the winter fighting, they've got roughly 140 serviceable tanks across the whole length of the frontier. Everything else is either getting fixed, repaired, or just turned back into hot metal to make more tanks, I suppose. They lost over 1 million men. He's fired about 50 generals whom he didn't trust because he just doesn't think they're following his orders. But the crucial thing was, again, this is a phrase I'm bringing up a lot because I'm talking to military men mainly, is he thought he'd saved the day because it's the Russian counteroffensive that winter after Barbarossa. He had been the one to say, stand by your posts. We're not going to retreat. We're going to rescue our units that have been encircled, and we're going to fight our way out. And it worked, crucially, that winter. But that would have a knock-on effect for what we know would happen at Stalingrad. So Directive 41 is basically the famous spring offensive, Case Blue, that would launch in June 1942. It works. So what would happen? They're breaking through into the Caucasus. Phase 1 is to capture the main key places that can access more supplies and open the gateway to southern Russia. Stalingrad, as you can see by the arrow, was really only meant to be a flanking maneuver to protect the flank as Army groups A and B would then move down to basically capture the oil. It's all about the oil. They have to capture everything around Grozny and Maikop. But it didn't work. The fighting's intense. The Russians are putting up far more of a fight than they were expecting, even though they caught them, as I said at the beginning, on the hop, because Stalin had expected the main thrust would be to the center, so that's where the bulk of his new forces, his rebuilt armies were. But he will rush them down because Hitler needs a victory. He's lost. By the time they were approaching Stalingrad and they thought, well, let's just try and capture the city, they'd again taken colossal losses. They'd had about 150,000 wounded and killed in those first 6 weeks of the fighting. They're not going to capture the oil field, so we have to get something, we'll take Stalingrad. As I said before, Stalingrad was the model city, which is probably why it drove Hitler to say, I want it. It's named after Stalin himself. It had been just a local village. It's on the Volga. It had been one of many fishing villages that had been then turned as modernization of Russia under the Tsars at the end of the 19th century. The railways come in. Therefore, all the huge, vast wheat supplies that you can grow in the Caucasus, Stalingrad became the main. It was Tsaritsyn at the time, but it would be called Stalingrad after the communists took over. It would become the center of agricultural machinery production, mainly built and constructed the factories by British and French and American money and engineer experts. They all went there in the 1920s and basically built Stalin a colossal industrial works in the northern part of the city. What he wanted in the center, which is what you can see here, is, I mean, this is what would happen at the end of the war, at the end of the battle. This is all gone. But it was, as outside of Moscow, it was probably the most fashionable city to be in the whole of the Soviet Union. It had pretty much everything that Moscow had in terms of buying power. You could go to the shops, cinemas, theaters, an amazing university. The workers were very, very well looked after. They were earning great wages. So it was seen as a model of success, which is why Stalin allowed access for foreign investment, but also foreign reporters to report on it. So this is the kind of city the Germans were going to come up to when they're on that advance. We all know, you probably know this photo, just remember it when we see the final photo, the Sixth Army. So this is the army that had the nickname the Conqueror of Capitals. This is the one that had delivered Western Europe to Hitler in the first year and a half of the war. It absolutely blown away anything put in its path. It was the premier infantry unit that Hitler wanted to use, that he'd actually rebuilt specifically after Barbarossa because they'd taken casualties too. And he wanted to give it everything in order to see if they could make a success of this new campaign in 1942. Leading it, however, that's the main issue. Looking through the binoculars there is Field Marshal Paulus. He wasn't Field Marshal at the time, General Paulus, Friedrich Paulus. And an amazing planner. So when I was researching him and looking at his archives, he had been one of the premier planners of German military action in Western Europe all the way through those first 2 years of the war, 39 through to 41. He'd helped war game Barbarossa. He'd actually written a report saying Barbarossa wouldn't work. So he got one thing right. But through happenstance, the man that they had who was the dynamic military commander who was going to lead the Sixth Army died of a stroke. So they gave Paulus the step up. Primarily, I would argue, because Hitler didn't want someone to argue with him, and Paulus was not that kind of guy anyway. He would follow orders, as we'll see as the battle commences. But this is Paulus studying the city of Stalingrad. And he mentioned in his letters after the war, when he was in captivity, that when he was studying the city, it's 20 miles long and only about a mile deep, because it's like a ribbon along the River Volga. And as I was saying, you've got the old part of the city, you've got the fresh part, the brand new modern part, but it's the factory district that's the most important. That's the one that's now pumping out weapons, armored boats, armored trains, tanks, all sorts of weapons, machine guns, munitions. That's what the factory district does. So it is a military target. But he's looking at it thinking, even though he's got about 170,000 men that have survived the 6-week campaign to get to Stalingrad, he's got probably the bulk of the Luftwaffe strength on the Eastern Front has been given to him, and they're going to pound the city. He's still thinking, this is an enormous objective. Can I capture this? This is one of the legends that I really wanted to investigate. So the first 2 days, the last week of August, is when the Luftwaffe launched about 3,200 sorties in 48 hours over Stalingrad. And they obviously bomb it into the Stone Age. But famously, Russian propaganda, which is then picked up by Western newspapers and radio reports, apparently 48,000 Russians died on that first day of bombing along the banks there. And so I wanted, there's only, I think, they would argue, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and at the time when they thought more people had died at Dresden, and then it was Stalingrad. But when I studied the civic reports from all the casualty stations, there's about 18 casualty stations right across Stalingrad. And I could only find something like 2,100 casualties across all 18 stations. So again, it's trying to pick your way through what is legend and myth and what is actually the case. Because again, it's said that, they didn't have air raid shelters, and they did have air raid shelters. A lot of them weren't deep enough, but they definitely had air raid shelters. But I wanted to show, I put these ones in because I just thought you'd appreciate this as a military audience. I've gone to the Stalingrad Museum. I was allowed there because it was locked down, but I got there. So I've managed to get the Russian side of the story. I can't get to Germany because at the time they were in proper lockdown like we were. So I couldn't travel there. So what I did was, the division, the so-called German division that's going to attack Pavlov's house, it was the 71st Infantry Division. Again, it was in the vanguard of the 6th Army. It was a premier fighting force. And I put adverts, it's in the units from southern Germany. So I found 6 regional newspapers, and I put adverts in there saying, did you have a relative at Stalingrad? Was he serving in the 71st Infantry Division? And I got 37 replies over about a 6-7 month period. And by far the best thing that happened was this man here. So this is Colonel Friedrich Roska, and he is the main character in my book. And he was the commander, he would be the commander of the 71st Infantry Division at the end of the battle. But at the time, as you can see him here, he was a company commander, and then, as we know, as officers start dying in battle, you get quick promotion. So he quickly became, in the campaign of 42, he was, by the time he arrived at Stalingrad, a colonel. So he's in charge of a regiment, and he was in charge of the 194 Infantry Regiment. But crucially for me, he survived the battle, and he kept a diary, and he kept a journal. He was an ex-architect, so he was drawing plans and sketches of what he saw. He survived 5 months. He survived the whole campaign fighting in the city. And he kept it in a briefcase, and no one had seen it. So his son, who was about 80 at the time, who's a doctor, retired, said, he answered my advert and said, would you like this? And I said, absolutely. And he started to scan them and trying to email to them. And in the end, he gave up and said, I'm just going to send you his briefcase. So the briefcase was, I don't think I've kept the briefcase came, had a giant, it's like a Hollywood movie. It had a giant swastika and eagle as you opened it. And it's literally full of his diaries. And obviously we translated it. And it just tells an epic survival story from giddy with delight, because he led, these are his photos, he was responsible for the first German unit to break through the city's defenses and get to the Volga. And they did that on the 13th of September. And it caused jubilation in Hitler's headquarters, because he's thinking, we've broken through, we're going to capture the city very quickly. Because he was a very dynamic infantry commander, Oscar. Consternation in Moscow. Stalin's like, what the hell's going on? The city named after me is going to fall if we carry on like this. But these are quite rare photographs. These are his troops. Generally, that vehicle there, that's a Stug. So that's a motorized assault. Basically, it's a gun on top of a Panzer III tank chassis. But that was the vehicle of choice the Germans used in urban combat. They needed motorized assault guns. So most of the armor losses they had in Stalingrad really were those Stug 3s. So to counter this, and that photo I showed you of Alexander Radimtsev, this is what he looked like at the time. He was a battle-hardened divisional commander. He was only in his late 30s. Again, he was one of these heroes of the Soviet Union. He'd been tested already in the Spanish Civil War. And then he'd seen from Barbarossa all the way through to Stalingrad, he'd been in the front line fighting. His division had been destroyed 3 times. So he's ordered by, you might recognize this gentleman here, he's the new commander for the defense of the center of Stalingrad, Chukov. And he's the one who brings in all these brutal orders in terms of setting up penal battalions, officers being shot for not following orders, sending in mass waves of frontal assaults to blunt the German advance, because that's the key thing about the battle is it's all about firepower. The reason why the Russians took so many casualties, over 1 million men by the end of the battle, and the reason why the Germans were winning, even though they're outnumbered 3-1 in terms of combat troops, is they've got the best firepower and they've mastered the skill of combined warfare in terms of air assaults, artillery, infantry attacks, all joined up. And that's why it's costing colossal losses. So, as you can see from this map, in grey and in black is where Rosker's unit, the 71st Infantry Division, has punched its way through the heart of the city, and now they're in the premier position of occupying the major buildings like the NKVD House, the Brewery, the State Bank, House of Specialists, and you'll see in Pavlov's house in a second. But Radimtsev's just arrived on the eastern bank, as that's how these troops are ferried in. That's the only accurate thing about the Jude Law film, Enemy at the Gate, is that crossing in the boats. In terms of the firepower the Germans brought during the daytime, and the Russians took colossal losses. So Radimtsev, on the 14th of September, the day after Rosker's division's taken it, he's ordered his 10,000 men, fresh, just been rebuilt, got destroyed about 3 months previously. He's ordered by Chukov, you have to take the West Bank back, don't care how many men it costs. And so they do it. And it's called Radimtsev's Wall, as you can see there. That's what they do, and that's what I describe in my book about the fighting. In the first 24 hours of hitting there, those 10,000 men push back Rosker's units. As you can see, the blue house that's just appeared there, that's Pavlov's house. That's why it's so important to both sides, because it's now in the center of where both sides are situated. Just as another statistic, Radimtsev took in 10,000 men into Stalingrad. By the end of the battle, I think there was 189 left. Obviously, it got rebuilt with replacements, but of the original 10,000, 189 were left. And that's a metaphor for all the divisions that came in. The one thing that is accurate is the life cycle of a Red Army soldier going into Stalingrad was less than 24 hours, purely because it's the firepower of the Germans that they can bring, added to the really crude, basic tactics the Soviets were using in the first 6 weeks of the battle, massed frontal assaults, and they're just getting decimated. So that's where we are. This I wanted to put in because, again, this sums up what propaganda can do. This shows you, obviously, 2 Soviet Red Army soldiers. They're obviously about to attack somewhere in the central district, a German-occupied house. But in reality, that would never have happened in the daylight. Within 6 weeks, as I said, Chukov had realized, I'm making a mistake with my tactics. We've got to stop frontal assaults. We've got to stop daytime frontal assaults specifically. And we've got to start using the night to our advantage and getting ourselves behind enemy lines, punch through their poorly manned perimeters and causing chaos with small teams that will be shock groups. So this is celebrating shock groups because that's what they were armed with. They were lightly armed. They just had submachine guns and bags of grenades. And they were usually 4 to 8 man teams. And they would be the ones that would go into no man's land, cross it, and try and take the buildings. And that's where you get the development of what the Germans would call Rats War, Rattenkrieg. This is exactly how it happened. But they operated at night because the Germans owned the daytime because of the air and artillery superiority they had. And I like the way they've placed the helmet just to the left there so you can know they're fighting Germans. So this is where Pavlov comes in. And I've studied and researched this guy a lot because he is very, very, very famous. So a lot of you might remember the old World War I infantryman. He died quite a few years ago. Harry Patch, who was always taken to the cenotaph in his wheelchair. I mean, Pavlov is on the same level as Harry Patch to Russians. They've got T-shirts, posters, everything of him today. He's just from he's an ordinary farm boy that grew up 50 miles to the east of Moscow in a very basic, rundown agricultural community, semi-literate. But he did join up. He answered the call right at the beginning of Barbarossa. So by the time he's at Stalingrad, he's already been injured twice, wounded in battle, and he's a sergeant, and he's in one of those shock groups. So he's basically a grunt. He's just following orders. If he's told to go into no man's land and take a house, he'll take a house. So as the story goes, as I said at the beginning, he's ordered to take a shock group and to take this house in the center of no man's land. And at the time, as I say in the book, there was no fighting going on in this area. By the time we have the Pavlov story, where they're fighting a division, the 71st Infantry Division was pretty much decimated by then. They'd taken loads and loads of casualties. They're refitting, waiting for resupply with fresh troops. They don't want to fight anybody. Equally, Rudimtsev's 13th Guards, they're in the same position. Both sides are warily looking at each other from their lines. But what they are doing is they're, as you do, and you see that in the First World War with trench warfare, they're sending, to keep them honest, they're sending shock groups out both sides to poke away and see where the enemy's lines are. And that's what Pavlov is supposed to be doing for this house. He takes the house, it then gets resupplied in the famous story. 28, his whole platoon comes. And then they defend it, like I said, for 58 days from massed infantry assaults, air attacks, armoured attacks, and they fight them all off. And they cause, again, one of the legends is that they teach Russian school children is more Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than died trying to capture Paris. And from what I remember, they captured Paris without a shot being fired. But anyway, that's the story. So, how do we get to this story? And this is probably the most interesting part of the book, in my opinion, anyway. This man here is Lieutenant Andrei Shapurin. He was a playwright before the start of the war, and like many, he answered the call, and instead of going on the front line, he's then taken into the propaganda wing of the Red Army. Every single unit, from division all the way up, sometimes even battalion strength level, they had their own propaganda team. And each of those teams produced a daily newspaper, sometimes 2, sometimes 4 pages. It's not daily, weekly paper. And it's mainly for propaganda purposes, political slogans. You might have a speech from Stalin. You might have a speech from your divisional or army commander. But they become much more prevalent in 1942 when Russia thinks this is the end because the Germans can't be stopped. They're smashing everything in their way. They're about to capture Stalin's city. And that's why there's such world interest over that summer, because everyone thought that if Stalingrad falls, Russia might be out of the game, out of the Second World War. So, to keep up the morale of a city that by the time he comes on into the picture in October, about mid-October, as the winter hasn't come in yet, the Germans own 95% of Stalingrad. They're just fighting now for the last bits in the northern district. The heart of Stalingrad is pretty much taken. There's only Rudimtsev's units clinging on. They've only got like about 100 meters deep worth of land to protect in the heart of the city. So he's like 24 reporters that's sent out onto the front lines, and they're ordered to find feel-good stories because we have to keep the morale up. So he goes to, and the papers in the museum all point to this. He's sent to the area where the 13th Guards are. He interviews them, all the survivors, and he finds out that, some of them are in this house. They're artillery spotting at the moment. And so and that's how safe it was. He manages to go out in the daylight to get to this destroyed building. And he interviews some of the team. There's 2 officers in charge of that house, but the playwright in him spots the story. And so everything he talks about is, let's center it on the normal Red Army grunts. And he picks Pavlov. And so he invents the story of what happened, how they took this house, who Pavlov is, what's his role. He becomes like the man he's the commander when he wasn't the commander of the house. And it shows you the power of the written word because it gets published about 2 weeks later in the divisional newspaper in Stalingrad. So the troops and the civilians that are still there are reading it. And within 2 weeks of that being published, so by the beginning of November, it's on national radio being broadcast as a drama across the whole country. And so it becomes, you could argue, too big to fail. And so the legend is set in place. So we're going to carry on there, but I'm skipping forward. But the battle, and a lot of you probably know the Battle of Stalingrad. So This is where Rosca comes back into the picture, and what I really go to town in the last part of the book is because his division has accrued so many casualties in terms of commanding officers. His own commander, 3 days before the end, so this is Paulus coming into surrender at the end of the battle, at the end of January 43, once the counteroffensive by the Soviets has surrounded the Germans, not just in the city, but 50 to 100 kilometers to the north and south. They've smashed the Romanian and Hungarian armies that were protecting the German flank, and they've snared about 320,000 German troops. And over the next month, they just pound and pound away until the Germans are in what they would call kessels within the city. Paulus is still surviving. He's not going to commit suicide like Hitler's ordered him to and made him a field marshal. But crucially, what Rosca's memoir that was unpublished tells us is that he was actually in command. His own divisional commander, a guy called Alexander von Hartmann, very, very tough character, had decided, like many senior German officers, I would rather go out fighting, all guns blazing. So the day before the surrender, his commander von Hartmann just steps up on the trench with a rifle, starts taking pot shots at anyone he can see until a Russian sniper picks him off and kills him. So Rosca finds himself in charge, and it's Rosca who actually hands over the German 6th Army in Stalingrad, because Paulus is a quivering wreck in in Rosca's HQ. It's the 71st Infantry Division, were the main division holding out in the centre of the city right to the end. And much as I talked about the casualties for Radimtsev's division, it's the same for the 71st. They mirror each other very much in terms of, as I said, the 71st Infantry Division probably went into Stalingrad with about 6,500 men. At full strength, they would have been around about 9,000. But by the end, there's about 230 of them left. And of that, I think 6 of them got home by the 50s. So that's a metaphor for the German army. So this is what was left of them. 55,000 go into captivity, roughly 55,000 German troops and their Romanian and Hungarian allies. Roughly 5,000 make it home by the mid-1950s. The city itself is completely destroyed, even though I was saying to you it's 20 kilometers long, kilometer deep. Only 12% of civic buildings remain. They've had almost 20 million either bullets or bombs dropped on the city over that 5 months worth of fighting. It needs to be rebuilt. And this is happening even while the fighting's going on. So these photos are taken around about when the fighting for Kursk is going on, the great tank battle, in July 43. So what they do is, again, not many people know the story. Not all the Germans surrendered at Stalingrad. There's roughly around about 3 to 4,000 refused to surrender, and they hide themselves away in the cellars and the ruins of the city. And Stalin ordered an NKVD division to go in and ferret them out. And it took another month of fighting, because these guys fought to the last, really. Not many of them survived until they could make the city safe. And then they start trying to rebuild. And as we can see from the photos, it's either prisoners of war or women that are going to rebuild the cities. And this would be reflected in all the other cities in the Soviet Union on the European side that were destroyed. Because one thing that Putin argues, and you think, well, actually, you've got a point, is in terms of the destruction of the European side of Russia that the Germans occupied. You're talking about 78,000 plus towns, villages, and cities completely destroyed by the occupiers. They all have to try to be rebuilt, like Stalingrad would be. And this is where Pavlov comes back into the story. So what we have here, this woman here is called Maria Cherkasova. And she's a communist, diehard communist. She survived, stayed in Stalingrad for the whole of the battle. And so what she did was, and again, it's part political theatre. She put a statement out in the city newspaper to say, it's ordinary Russian citizens, mainly communists, we have a duty to rebuild our city ourselves. We shouldn't wait for the government. We don't need money. We can do it. And I'm going to rebuild the city. And the first building I want to rebuild is this house that we've all heard about throughout the whole fighting in 1942-43, Pavlov's house. So who's with me? And so it is political coercion. It's her whole tower block turns out, and they spend the next month or two rebuilding that house, Pavlov's house, and then they go on to the next. And to cut a long story short, this is her as they're celebrating the house has been rebuilt, and children are looking at the graffiti Soviet soldiers had left on Pavlov's house. But it would be called the Cherkasova movement, because she would then go as a poster girl around the rest of the Soviet Union after the Second World War had finished to say, I rebuilt Stalingrad, we can now rebuild all the others, like Minsk and Sevastopol and Kyiv. But they needed to have someone with her. And this is where Pavlov comes back in. And he would travel around the Soviet Union with her, because by now he's a national figure. This photo of him here, as you can see, he's pretty much got every, I call this the Muttley image. He's got every medal could possibly be bestowed upon him for a simple sergeant. This is him in about 1978, 79. And his life after the war was amazing. So he finished the war as a lieutenant of artillery. He was wounded again. But he was then brought into Moscow, and he lived in the elite section of the city. Both his children went to the elite university and had the finest education. And then he was used as a poster boy, not just in Russia, but in other Eastern European countries, even got as far as Angola and Cuba in the 1960s. And it was all about, this is the hero of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. But what I found out in the archives, and I found this picture as well, is a bit like Band of Brothers. So the 13th Guards Rifle Division, on the anniversary of their great crossing of the Volga on the 14th of September, they would meet on the embankment that they took from the Germans, and it's called Redimtsev's Wall. It's been rebuilt. And obviously over the years, they're dying off, but this is from the 1970s as well. And they retell their stories, have drinks, sing songs. And it got to the point where Pavlov, and I got this from a lot of the letters I read from the veterans from this unit, they were talking about him, and he started to refuse to come to the reunions because he was getting ribbed so much. Like, well, I was with you and I didn't get anything. And I fought with you in the summer campaign, I fought with you in Stalingrad, I then fought with you on the advance to Berlin, and no one's calling me a hero. And so by the late 70s, he wasn't going to the reunions anymore, according to the correspondence. But then when you look at actually the fight for the house itself, this shows you why it didn't exist. Because what I did was, as you would normally do, you try and you follow the paper trail of the actual orders of his unit. So he's in the 13th Guards Rifle Division. This is his regimental commander, Colonel Yelin. In one of the letters I read that he sent to the museum in the 1960s, he actually takes Pavlov to task and says, well, I don't understand why he's been given the Order of Lenin, because if he has to, I have to sign it off. I have to write the citation. No one ever asked me. I don't even know really what he did and who he is. And then it got down to his company commander, which is Zhukov, Major Zhukov there, top there. He is absolutely raging. So there's about 3 letters that I read where he's gradually getting angrier and angrier, and to the point where I was thinking, you'll end up in a gulag if you keep this up, to where he just says it's all fabrication. And it's a lie that the government, he actually uses the word lie, it's a lie that the government doesn't want to be exposed, because I was the commander of Pavlov's house. I was on the ground there, and we actually didn't see that much fighting. And then probably the saddest one is Pavlov's platoon lieutenant, Afanasyev. And he was the one who captured the house, and he's just written out of history, completely written out of history, to the point where I actually did find in a Moscow kiosk, it got to the point where out of frustration, he wrote his own memoir, and he tells the story of how he captured the house and how he got wounded defending it. He doesn't talk about it was a great battle or anything like that. And that's in paperback, which you can find today if you go looking for it. But this is where you get the reality, I suppose. This is another veterans reunion. This is Redimtsev. he would end up being one of the most senior commanders in the Warsaw Pact in the 1980s because he was a brilliant, brilliant military leader, completely fearless. But he's at one of the veterans unions, and they managed to, I was amazed to find this, there was a photo taken with both him, and that's Afanasyev, the lieutenant who's airbrushed out of history. And he actually became a school teacher. And again, there's letters from his wife and his oldest daughter to say that basically he was lent upon in terms of if you say anything, it must have been maybe when he published his book in the 80s, to say you won't get a state pension, you'll lose your job if you carry on talking about you were the commander of Pavlov's house. It's Pavlov's house. That's the end of it. And it's a shame, but equally, I think the senior leaders in the Red Army at Stalingrad appreciated what had happened to him, because when his divisional commander Radimtsev died, he requested in his will that Afanasyev carry his ashes to be buried in Volgograd. So you can make that what you will. But I put this photo in because I found this out, and I just thought at the time when Putin had just invaded Ukraine, and you go to the Volgograd Museum is still open today, completely different museum. So when I went, they were still kind of semi in love with the fact that they were going to be part of the West. We'd become friends now. So there was a lot of evidence that the Allies had given them Lend-Lease. So there's American equipment in the museum, there was a Jeep there, that kind of thing. And my friend Mikhail, who lives there, sent me photos on WhatsApp. He really shouldn't have done, but he did. They've completely all changed it. So when you walk into the museum, it's this huge exhibition of Nazi memorabilia that they've captured from Ukrainian soldiers in the fighting over the last, obviously made up. But they've turned it into a real showcase of why they're fighting Ukrainians. They're Nazis. But this guy here is Major General Ivan Lashkin, and he took the surrender of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. And at the time, for the 6 months of the surrender, when he took the surrender, and then the 6 months afterwards, he was an absolute superstar. He was going all around the Soviet Union, being interviewed, photographs, awarding medals, that kind of thing. And the key thing is, he's Ukrainian. And that's one of the things that I suppose Putin doesn't want to talk about. Of the 18 ethnic groups or nationalities that comprised the Soviet Union and made up the Red Army, obviously Russians were predominantly the biggest ethnic group in the Red Army. Second biggest ethnic group of the Red Army in the Second World War were Ukrainians. Roughly around about 4 million fought in the Red Army. Obviously, a lot fought for the Germans too. It's almost like a civil war. But the casualties the Ukrainians took for the Soviet Union in the Second World War amount to more than the casualties of Britain, France, and America combined in the whole of the Second World War in all theatres. So it shows you the commitment of the Ukrainians to the Great Patriotic War. But again, his downfall represents what can happen in Stalin's Russia. And as I said at the beginning, Stalingrad's a great battle, great victory. Everyone wants a piece of it. Everyone wants to be associated with it. So he was inundated with political pressure from ministers, generals to say, can you sign this letter? Because he's wearing what would be the Stalingrad medal. And they minted about 2.5 million of them. And they are, they're gold dust. If you got one of those on, especially after the war, guarantees you free drinks everywhere, I suppose. But he refused all offers. He just said, I'm not going to be bought. I'm not going to say you were there when you weren't there. And so he was invited to come up to Moscow 6 months after the war had finished. The battle had finished. And he was arrested on trumped-up charges, thrown into the Lubyanka, and he only survived because Stalin died of a stroke in 1953. And then he was amongst thousands that were released. But 1943 is when his war ended on trumped-up charges. And Roska, this is the sad part of the story, and it's in the book, but it's a spoiler alert, whatever. He was on one of the last transports to come back in 1955. He served in many of the bigger prisons in Siberia and down into the Caucasus. He used his training as an architect to help build camps, that kind of thing. And from what his family told me, he just couldn't settle back. Because again, it's when I was looking through his briefcase and I looked at a lot of the photographs, I would surmise that he was a big supporter of Hitler, just judging by a lot of the photos that he's in with a lot of Nazis and Gestapo types. And he's serving in an army that's in the vanguard of a genocidal campaign in Russia. But when he came back, he was clearly suffering PTSD. He tried to join the West German army. He was living in Dusseldorf, that's where he's from, and they refused. He was then taken to court for about a year, not a year, probably about 6 months, on charges of being a war criminal, but then the case was thrown out. And this is what the family told me. I hadn't put it in the books. They told me after I'd written the book. But basically, I knew he died. He died a year after he came back, and he killed himself on Christmas Eve. But what I found out after the book was published, his granddaughter told me, was his wife woke up next to him in bed on Christmas Day, and he'd taken cyanide. And so I went back to his journal and read it, and in his journal, the divisional surgeon had given all the senior officers cyanide to say, if you don't want to be taken, take this. So I'm guessing he must have, by somehow, kept his cyanide pill. But in some ways, I'm glad I didn't put it in that book because it would have maybe upset the family. But that's how he died. And so this is his burial stone. And his son said to me that it was the biggest reunion of the 71st Infantry Division on the date of his funeral. They all came. Because, most of them had survived because of him, because he was such an effective commander. And so this is what I was thinking. I was talking to you, Ian, about this doesn't happen anymore because of what's going on for the past 3 years. But it's such a massive campaign. It's not just ordnance you find bodies. If you want to go looking for them, you'll find them, because there are literally thousands still out there that were thrown into rifle pits that have then grown over. If you're approaching the Volgograd airport, you're basically flying over miles and miles and miles and miles of either scrubland or wheat fields. And if it's scrubland, you can pick out the rifle pits. They're still there. There are all these humps just all along the rivers. And so I joined these guys. I'd heard about them, and it's an international, as you can see from the flags, it's an international kind of archaeological military enthusiast group. And when I was there with them, there was Italians, Australians, South Africans, a couple of Americans, a couple of Germans, and a couple of Russians, obviously. And they were allowed then that they go out, they get the information of where units were, and then they just go looking for them. And so roughly, they found one when I was with them. They found roughly around 300 bodies a year. And they can be German, they can be Romanian, Hungarian, obviously Soviet. And then they take them back and give them a decent funeral. And so this is where we were. And this is one of many cemeteries around Stalingrad, and they're enormous. They're, multiple widths of football fields, you could say. And on the one side is the Soviets. And as you can see, they put the helmets there. And generally, they have them in big groups because you can't identify all the bodies. And so you just pile them in. The Germans do likewise. This is it was paid for by the West German government. Now it's the national government. That they have this, which it looks a bit more stylized. And because again, you find that out, and I put it in the book, the reports after the battle there are literally tens of thousands of bodies frozen all around the city, corpses everywhere. And even Nikita Khrushchev recorded that in his own memoir, saying that the stench was unbelievable, the sight was unbelievable, and they just had to clean up the city really quickly. So there are giant corpse pits all over the city that have now been built on. You just don't know they're there. So the German government decided that they would record every single German soldier that had died in the Battle of Stalingrad by this symbolic kind of, hundreds and hundreds of these kind of Rubik's cubes, and they're about this high. And they've just got a couple of hundred names on each of them. And they're there as far as the eye can see. You can see them in the distance of that photo. I mean, there's literally hundreds of them. It's impressive and poignant at the same time. And I do believe that's the end. So like I said, it's not a talk on the Battle of Stalingrad. It's on the human perspective of Stalingrad. And I hope that's been educational to a degree. Thank you. Is that all right?
Thank you, Ian, for a fantastic talk. Right, so it's 50.